Daniel sat across from me at our kitchen table on a Wednesday evening and told me he was leaving. Not in anger, not after a fight, not in the middle of anything that would have made it easier to understand. He sat down while I was still clearing the dinner plates, folded his hands the way he did in work presentations, and said he needed to talk. I set the plates down. I sat. And then he told me, in the measured, careful tone of a man who had rehearsed this, that he was in love with someone else. Her name was Vanessa. She worked in the strategic partnerships division of his company, 2 floors above his office. He said it hadn't been planned. He said it had simply happened. He said, with the specific cruelty of someone choosing honesty over kindness, I'm happier with her than I've been in a long time. I sat at that table for a moment without speaking. The refrigerator hummed. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a car went past on the street. He had already filed the paperwork, he added. He had spoken to a lawyer. He wanted to keep things civil. I looked at him across the table. At the man I had been married to for 9 years, at the face I knew better than my own, and I felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger. It was recognition. Because sitting there listening to how carefully he had planned his exit, I understood that this conversation had not been sudden at all. The week after Daniel moved out, I found out through a text from a college friend named Bree, who didn't know how to say it gently and so said it directly. Vanessa had already moved into Daniel's new apartment. Not after the divorce was finalized. Not after the paperwork was processed. Before any of it. The boxes were barely unpacked before she had a key. Bree sent me a screenshot. A photo someone had posted from a small gathering at Daniel's new place. Vanessa standing in the kitchen of an apartment I had never been to, holding a wine glass that caught the light, looking entirely at home in a life that had apparently been being prepared for her while I was still living in mine. I sat with my phone on the couch and looked at the photo for a long time. Then Bree sent a second message. She said she hadn't wanted to pile on, but she thought I should know. Daniel had introduced Vanessa to people in their shared professional circle as his partner weeks before he had told me anything. Weeks. While I was making dinner and going to work and living the ordinary life of a woman who did not yet know her marriage was over, he had been introducing another woman as his future. The specific timing of that sat with me differently than the betrayal itself. It was the timeline that told me who he actually was. I stayed off social media for the first 2 weeks after Daniel left, which meant that when I finally looked, there was more to find than I had prepared for. Their company had hosted a client dinner, formal, photographed, posted on the firm's official page with full tagging. Daniel and Vanessa were in 4 of the photos, standing together near the bar, laughing at something, seated at the same table, their shoulders almost touching. In one photo, someone had caught them mid-conversation, both leaning forward with the easy physical comfort of people who had stopped performing distance. The comments were generous and oblivious. Several colleagues had written things about what a dynamic team they made. One person had used the phrase power couple. I read the comments once, closed the app, and sat quietly in my car in the parking garage for about 10 minutes. Then my phone buzzed. A direct message from someone I didn't recognize, a name I didn't know, a profile with minimal information. The message was 4 words and a period. There's more you don't know. I stared at it. I didn't respond immediately, but I screenshotted it because I had learned in the past 2 weeks that the details that arrived sideways were often the ones that mattered most. I drove home. I made tea. And I started thinking about timelines in a way I hadn't let myself do before. Once I started looking, the timeline assembled itself with a clarity that was almost worse than the original conversation. The business trip to Denver in March, 14 months earlier. The one where Daniel had come home quieter than usual, more distracted, checking his phone in a way that I had noticed but explained away. The client dinner in November that had run until midnight. The shift in how he talked about his work, less complaint, more energy, the particular brightness of someone who had found a new reason to go in. I had attributed all of it to professional momentum. I had been proud of him for it. I found the thing I had unknowingly helped facilitate while going through the contacts on an old shared calendar account we had both forgotten to remove access from. A lunch, 11 months ago, that Daniel had scheduled under a client name I didn't recognize. I looked up the name. It didn't correspond to any client on his firm's public roster. The date fell 2 days after I had reminded him, cheerfully, without suspicion, to make time to connect with his colleagues. I had encouraged him to invest in those work relationships. I had covered for him when he came home late, made excuses to friends when he canceled plans, kept the household running, so he had mental space to focus. I had not been enabling his career. I had been enabling his affair. That understanding arrived quietly and sat heavily. The engagement announcement went up on a Saturday morning, for months after Daniel had sat across from me at our kitchen table. Our divorce had not yet been finalized. The state required a waiting period, and the paperwork was still moving through the process at the pace these things moved. None of that appeared to have slowed anything down. The announcement was posted on Vanessa's social media, a photo of her hand, a diamond catching the light, a caption that said simply, "He asked with a heart." Daniel's profile reposted it within the hour. I learned about it not from either of them, but from Bree, who sent it with a message that was just 3 question marks. I put my phone face down and took a walk around the block. When I came back, I sat at the desk in my home office and looked at the calendar. The divorce filing date, the engagement announcement date, the gap between them, the wedding date Vanessa had mentioned in the comments, just over 5 months away. I did the arithmetic. They were moving with the particular speed of people who had been waiting for something to become official for a long time. I had known intellectually that the relationship predated the divorce conversation. But seeing the dates arranged in a row made it something more than knowledge. It made it a documented sequence. I opened a new folder on my desktop and began saving things I thought I might want to keep. Daniel called me 6 weeks before the divorce was finalized to discuss the settlement terms. He used the word amicable 4 times in a 15-minute conversation. He said he hoped we could handle this like adults. He said it would be easier for both of us if things stayed clean and uncomplicated. He offered a figure that was fair in the narrow sense that it reflected the legal minimum he was obligated to provide and nothing more. He said he thought we both deserved a fresh start. I listened to all of it. Then I said, calmly and without any particular emotion in my voice, that I thought the terms were reasonable and that I was willing to proceed. He paused. I think he had expected resistance, or at least negotiation. The absence of either seemed to unsettle him in a way that he couldn't quite identify. He said he was glad I was being mature about it. I thanked him for calling. Then I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of the office. The settlement was not ideal, but contesting it would have cost time, money, and energy that I had decided to spend differently. I had been doing the math quietly for several weeks. What I was keeping from the marriage was worth more than any negotiation could produce. Not property, not accounts. The 9 years of skill, discipline, and professional knowledge I had developed while he was building a career on the foundation I helped maintain. That wasn't in the settlement. It never had to be. I moved out on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the divorce was final. I had arranged it carefully. A moving company for the furniture, a storage unit for the things I wasn't yet sure about, a new apartment in a building 20 minutes from my office that I had signed the lease on quietly and without announcement. I had told almost no one. Bree knew. My sister knew. That was the full list. I didn't post anything. I didn't update my address publicly. I simply moved in the efficient and unremarkable way that people moved when they had decided to stop performing their feelings for an audience. The people in Daniel's circle who had expected a dramatic exit were apparently disappointed. Bree told me, with some amusement, that several mutual acquaintances had been watching for a public response, something emotional, something that could be interpreted as instability or bitterness. What they got was silence, which some of them apparently found more unsettling. I spent the first evening in the new apartment unpacking my desk first, the way I always set up a new space, starting with the place where work happened. Then I opened the folder on my laptop, the one I had been quietly filling for months. Payment records, correspondence archives, calendar exports, performance reviews. Not evidence of anything dramatic. Just the documented history of a professional life that was entirely my own and had never stopped belonging to me even when everything else felt like it had been borrowed. Daniel and Vanessa married on a Saturday in October in a venue outside the city that Bree described as genuinely beautiful. She had been invited through a mutual professional connection and attended with the specific curiosity of someone who wanted to be able to report back accurately. She sent me 3 messages during the reception, all measured and careful. The ceremony was elegant. Vanessa looked striking. Daniel appeared happy. The photos that appeared online over the following days confirmed the same. Tasteful venue, coordinated florals, a guest list that skewed professional and aspirational. Within a week, the couple had posted honeymoon photos from what appeared to be the Amalfi Coast, blue water, stone steps, the particular light that made everything look like it had been curated. The comments were enthusiastic. Colleagues congratulated them. People used words like goals and beautiful. I looked at the photos once, briefly, the way you looked at something you needed to see clearly in order to put away properly. They looked happy. I believed they probably were. But I had also, by then, developed a particular eye for the difference between happiness and performance. They were in the early stage where the two looked identical. I closed the browser, made a note in my calendar for a professional development course I had enrolled in, and went back to work. The first thing Bree noticed, about 8 months into the marriage, was a shift in how Daniel talked at professional events. She ran in the same industry circles and occasionally found herself in the same rooms. She reported back not with gossip, but with observation, the specific detachment of someone paying attention without agenda. She said Daniel had started arriving at events alone. That Vanessa, who had been a consistent presence at the same functions during their engagement period, was now frequently absent. That when her name came up in conversation, Daniel's responses had developed a certain carefulness, not dishonesty, but the particular precision of someone choosing words that could not be easily followed up on. At one event, a colleague had apparently asked casually how Vanessa was enjoying married life. Daniel had said fine, she's busy, and changed the subject. Bree said it was the kind of deflection that was invisible if you weren't looking for it and unmistakable if you were. I filed it without comment. I was not tracking Daniel's marriage out of investment in its outcome. I was tracking it the way you tracked weather, not because you controlled it, but because understanding patterns helped you prepare for what was coming and stop being surprised by the things that were already in motion. The name that started appearing in Bree's updates was Fletcher Crane. He was an investor, the kind that regional business publications profiled in their quarterly issues, the kind whose name appeared on building dedications and charity gala programs. Mid-50s, significantly wealthy, the sort of man whose professional reputation functioned as its own form of social gravity. He had entered the orbit of Daniel's firm through a potential partnership discussion, which meant he had been in the same rooms as Vanessa, who, in her role in strategic partnerships, would have been directly involved in those conversations. Bree first mentioned him in a message about an industry dinner, saying Vanessa had been photographed near him twice in the same evening and that the body language had been, in Bree's careful word, notable. I read the message and thought about patterns. I thought about the way Vanessa had moved from Daniel, then a rising professional, attractive but not exceptional, to a life she had clearly considered an upgrade. I thought about what Fletcher Crane represented relative to Daniel on any scale she had been using. I did not feel triumphant about this thinking. It was simply arithmetic. And the arithmetic, once you accepted what it described about Vanessa's decision-making, had only one logical direction. The late nights started again about 10 months into the marriage. Not Daniel's late nights, his. He was the one home, the one checking his phone, the one waiting. Bree confirmed this through a friend who worked in Daniel's building and had noticed, without particularly meaning to, that Daniel had begun staying at the office later than usual. Not working late in the visible, productive way of someone with a deadline. The kind of late that was quieter. The kind that happened when home had become somewhere a person wasn't entirely sure they wanted to be. He had started looking slightly less put together at professional functions, not dramatically, just in the small ways that registered only to people who had known what he looked like when everything was going well. The good shirt replaced by a fine but less considered one. The confidence in his posture slightly reduced from its previous elevation. These were small things. They would have been invisible to most people. But I had spent 9 years learning the language of Daniel's presentation, the difference between his maintained self and his actual self, and what Bree was describing was the gap between them widening. He had found a message he wasn't meant to see. She told me eventually. She didn't know the contents. She only knew that something had shifted, that the marriage had entered a different phase, and that the shift had happened in the direction anyone paying attention might have predicted. The confrontation, when it came, was apparently not the kind that involved raised voices or thrown objects. That detail felt consistent with what I knew of both of them. Bree heard the outline of it through a mutual colleague who had been present for the aftermath, not the conversation itself, but the visible evidence of it. Daniel had asked Vanessa directly about Fletcher Crane, about the time, the messages, the nature of what was developing. Vanessa had not denied it. She had not collapsed into apology. She had responded with the kind of clarity that only arrived in people who had already decided their next move before the current conversation began. She acknowledged the emotional involvement. She framed it not as a betrayal, but as a natural evolution. She used language about growth and compatibility and the difficulty of staying in something that no longer served you. Bree told me this through a series of messages over a Tuesday afternoon, each one slightly more carefully worded than the last, as if she was aware of the weight of what she was relaying. I read them in sequence while sitting in my car after a work meeting. I sat there for a few minutes after the last one. Outside, it was raining lightly, the kind of rain that didn't demand attention but made everything slightly quieter. I thought about sitting at a kitchen table 9 years earlier, listening to a man tell me about growth and compatibility and the difficulty of staying in something that no longer served him. History, I noted, had a particular way of making itself legible. Vanessa left Daniel for Fletcher Crane 11 months after their wedding. She moved out of their apartment over a single weekend. She had apparently been organized about it, a quality I recognized, having watched her operate professionally at a distance. The departure was clean and rapid, leaving very little administrative mess. She and Fletcher were photographed together publicly within 3 weeks of her moving out, which established the timeline for anyone who needed it established. Daniel found out through the same social channels everyone found things out through now: a photo, a tag, a comment thread that had moved faster than any private notification could. Bree told me that the phrase Vanessa had used in the final conversation, the one that had apparently been relayed through enough people that it had become part of the story people told, was one she had borrowed. People outgrow things. It was, word for word, the language Daniel had used to explain his decision to leave our marriage to the mutual friends who had asked. He had said it freely, without apparent irony, to people who had known both of us. Now it had been returned to him by someone who had learned the script from watching him use it. Whether Vanessa had chosen those words deliberately or accidentally, I would never know, but the symmetry was exact. And exact symmetry, in my experience, was never entirely accidental. The months after Vanessa left were not kind to Daniel in any of the ways that mattered to him. Bree tracked it not with pleasure, but with the repertorial accuracy of someone who believed I deserved accurate information about the landscape I was navigating. His finances had been restructured around a 2-income life in an apartment at a price point that had made sense when Vanessa was contributing and made considerably less sense when she wasn't. He was covering it, but covering it in the visible way, the way that required decisions. The work situation shifted more subtly. Not dramatically, not an emotion or a public failure, but the kind of quiet recalibration that happened when a man's confident professional presentation developed uncertainty at its edges. Several people in his circle had witnessed the marriage, the departure, and the aftermath in close enough proximity to form opinions. Opinions in professional environments had a way of becoming context. The version of Daniel that had existed before the divorce, assured, upward-moving, someone colleagues described as having momentum, was still present. But the framing around him had shifted. He had made choices that looked, from the outside, like a man who had miscalculated significantly. And miscalculation in the professional environments he moved in was noted even when it was never explicitly discussed. My life in the same period looked nothing like what Daniel's circle had apparently expected. I know this because Bree told me what people said when my name came up in those circles, and what they said had started as a kind of collective assumption of collapse and had shifted, gradually, into something more confused, and then something more respectful. I had taken the settlement money and a clear-eyed assessment of my skills and enrolled in a professional certification program in organizational consulting that I had been considering for 2 years and had kept deferring. I finished it in 7 months. I took on a contract role with a mid-sized firm that needed the specific kind of operational restructuring I had spent the better part of a decade learning to do informally. The contract became a full-time offer. I accepted it. I found a routine that was mine in a way that no routine during my marriage had quite been. Not because the marriage had been bad, in every sense, but because I had structured so much of my life around Daniel's needs and schedule that my own had existed mostly in the margins. Now there were no margins. There was just the work, the apartment, the friendships I had tended carefully, the mornings that belonged entirely to me. I was not performing recovery. I simply was quietly and completely recovered. I ran into Daniel on a Thursday afternoon outside a coffee shop near my office building. He was coming out as I was going in, and there was a half second where we both registered the other, and the social arithmetic of the situation resolved into the only reasonable response, which was to stop and acknowledge each other. He looked well-maintained, but slightly less than he had. The confidence was still there, but carried differently, with a fraction more effort. He said my name. I said his. He asked how I was. I said well, which was accurate. He looked at me with an expression I recognized, the specific recalibration of someone whose mental image of you has not kept pace with actual developments. The version of me he had been carrying in his mind since the divorce was, I suspected, the version from the kitchen table conversation. The version in front of him did not match it. I was not performing composure. I was simply composed. I was not presenting success. I was simply successful. The difference between performing a state and inhabiting it was, I had found, visible to people who were paying attention even when they couldn't articulate what they were seeing. Daniel was paying attention. He asked if I had time for coffee. I said I was heading to a meeting. He said of course. He said it was good to see me. I said the same. Then I went inside, ordered my coffee, and thought about the expression on his face for approximately 30 seconds before setting it down and moving on. Bree told me he had been asking about me. Not to her directly, he didn't know her well enough for that, but through people who knew people, the specific peripheral circulation of information that happened in overlapping professional social circles. He had asked how I was doing in the way that sounded casual, but wasn't. He had mentioned the coffee shop encounter to at least 2 people, framing it in different ways to different audiences, but always circling back to the same note, that I seemed to be doing well, that I seemed different, that he had been surprised by how different. I found this interesting not because it flattered me, but because of what it revealed. He had expected the version of me that matched his departure narrative. The man who left had told himself a story about the woman he was leaving, a woman defined by the marriage, dependent on the structure it provided, unlikely to be functional without it. That story had made his decision feel less like a loss and more like a correction. What he was encountering now was the evidence that the story had been wrong. And people who had told themselves a story that turned out to be wrong about someone they had underestimated had a very specific and predictable response. They started wanting to revise the ending. The message arrived on a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks after the coffee shop encounter. It came through a professional networking platform, formal enough to suggest deliberateness, not personal enough to suggest comfort with a more direct approach. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph said he hoped I was doing well and that the chance encounter had prompted him to reach out. The second paragraph said he had been doing a lot of thinking and that he realized, looking back, that he hadn't handled things well and that I deserved better than the way things had ended. The third paragraph said he missed our friendship and wondered if I would be open to coffee or lunch sometime, just to talk. It was well written. It was sincere in the way that messages were sincere when someone had spent time composing them. I read it twice. I did not respond. Not out of cruelty. I wasn't operating from cruelty, which was something I had become certain of in the months since the divorce. I didn't respond because I had nothing to say yet. He had sent a message that was partly apology, partly feeler, partly something he hadn't yet articulated clearly. I was willing to wait and see what he actually meant before deciding what, if anything, it warranted for me. He tried again 2 weeks later. This time through a regular text message, which meant he had kept my number and had decided the professional platform was too formal for what he was trying to say. The message was shorter and more direct. He said he knew he didn't have the right to ask for time, but that he would appreciate the chance to talk. He said he had things he wanted to say that he hadn't said well before. He said he understood if I wasn't interested. Over the following 10 days, There were 2 more messages and a voicemail. The voicemail was the most revealing. His voice had the slightly uncertain quality of someone who is not accustomed to being in the position of waiting for a response and was finding it uncomfortable. He mentioned closure. He mentioned wanting to make things right. He mentioned that he had been thinking about the years we had spent together and about how much of what he had built professionally had been possible because of the stability I had provided. That last sentence was the most honest thing in any of the messages. I read it 3 times. Then I called him back and said I was willing to meet once for coffee. He said yes before I finished the sentence. We met at a cafe near the waterfront on a Saturday morning. He arrived before me, which I noted, because Daniel had been chronically late for most of our marriage, and punctuality, for him, had always been a form of communication about priority. He stood when he saw me come in. We ordered coffee. We sat across from each other at a small table near the window, the harbor visible through the glass behind him, and for the first 5 minutes we talked about neutral things, the neighborhood, the coffee, a construction project on the street outside. He was nervous in a way that he was not entirely concealing. I was not nervous. I was simply present, which was its own kind of state. Then he began saying what he had come to say. He talked about Vanessa, not in detail, but enough. He talked about the marriage, the end of it, the recognition that had arrived too late about what he had given up. He talked about what he had seen when we ran into each other at the coffee shop. He said I seemed like a different person. I told him I was the same person. I just had more room to be her now. He looked at me when I said that. He held the look for a moment. And then he started to say the thing he had clearly been building toward, the thing the messages and the voicemail and the punctuality and the nervous hands all pointed toward. I let him finish before I responded. He had said that he had made a mistake, that he had been looking for something that turned out not to exist in the form he had imagined, that he had confused novelty for substance and had only understood the difference in retrospect. He said he wasn't asking for anything, not yet, he just wanted me to know where he stood. He said that knowing where he stood might be enough, just to have said it honestly to the person he should have been more honest with a long time ago. I listened to all of it. Then I set my coffee cup down, and I said what I had been thinking clearly since the waterfront cafe had come into view through the window on my walk over. I told him that I heard him, that I believed he meant what he was saying, that the growth he was describing was real and probably necessary and probably overdue, and that I had spent several months sitting with my own version of the past 9 years, looking at it without the emotional static that had made it hard to see clearly, and I had come to understand something that I thought he should know. I told him that the woman who had been sitting at that kitchen table when he announced he was leaving had been someone who had organized her entire life around his comfort and his momentum, who had reduced her own ambitions to fit the margins of his schedule, who had called that love and called it partnership and had believed both things sincerely. That woman was not here. She had not come to the cafe. She had been replaced, without drama and without announcement, by someone who did not need to be chosen by him to know her own value. He looked at me for a long moment after I finished. Then he said it plainly, which I respected. He said he wanted to try again. He said he knew that wasn't a small thing to ask. He said he wasn't asking me to forget anything, just to consider that people were capable of change, and that he believed he had changed in the ways that mattered. He said that what we had built together over 9 years was real, and that he had been wrong to treat it as something he could walk away from without consequence. He said he missed me. Not the life we had lived, not the structure, not the convenience. Me, specifically, the person he had been sitting across from at dinner tables and in cars and on Sunday mornings for nearly a decade. He said he understood if the answer was no. He said he would understand completely. He said it and meant it, and the honesty of his saying it was the clearest indication of how much had shifted in him since the kitchen table conversation. The man at the kitchen table had not been capable of that kind of directness about want. This man was. I sat with that for a moment. I noticed it. I gave it the acknowledgement it deserved. Then I took a breath and answered him. I told him no. Not with anger. There was no anger left by then, and I had discovered, in the quiet months of rebuilding, that the absence of anger was not the same as the presence of indifference. I was not indifferent to Daniel. I had loved him genuinely for a long time, and the traces of that were real and didn't need to be denied to arrive at a clear answer. I told him that I had spent the first months after the divorce in the specific grief of someone whose life had been reorganized without their consent. That I had then spent the following months in something better, the particular clarity that arrived when you stopped living in the margins of someone else's priorities and started living in the center of your own. I told him that the life I had now was not a consolation prize for the one I had lost. It was the life I should have been building all along, and I had only been able to build it because he had left. I told him that I was grateful for what we had been to each other, and that I held no bitterness about how it had ended, and that I genuinely hoped he found what he was looking for. And I told him as clearly and as kindly as I could that I was no longer the same person he had left, which meant I was no longer the person he was asking to come back. What he was reaching for no longer existed, and I had stopped mourning its absence a long time ago. He didn't argue. He nodded slowly, with the expression of someone absorbing something they had expected, but had hoped not to hear confirmed. We finished our coffee. The conversation moved into quieter territory. Work, the city, the kind of low-stakes exchange that people managed when the important thing had been said, and there was no need to fill the remaining time with anything heavy. When we stood to leave, he held the door for me. Outside, on the sidewalk, we stood for a moment in the November light, the harbor behind him glittering with the particular cold brightness of late autumn water. He said it was good to see me. I said the same, and meant it in the clean, uncomplicated way of someone who had no remaining business with a person and no remaining grief about that fact. He walked one direction, and I walked the other. I did not look back, not from pride. I simply had no reason to. There was nothing behind me that I was still trying to understand. The understanding had arrived, fully and without remainder, sometime in the months when I hadn't been paying attention to him at all. He was walking toward a version of himself that still had a great deal of work to do. I was walking toward an afternoon I was looking forward to, in a life that was entirely and irreversibly mine. 6 months after the cafe, I sat on the small balcony of my apartment on a Sunday morning with coffee and the particular contentment of someone who had nothing pressing and no performance to maintain. The city moved below me in its ordinary weekend way. Inside, on my desk, was a contract I had signed the previous week, a consulting partnership with a firm I had been hoping to work with for over a year, the kind of professional milestone that felt earned rather than given. On my phone were messages from Bree, from my sister, from a colleague I had become genuinely close to over the past year. A full life, built from scratch, in the space that had opened up when everything I thought I needed had been removed. I thought about Daniel occasionally in the way you thought about the weather from a previous year, not with longing or bitterness, just as a reference point for understanding where you now stood. He had made a choice that had cost him a great deal and had given me, inadvertently, everything. Not because losing him had been the goal, but because losing the life I had organized around him had cleared the way for the one I was actually supposed to be living. He had thought he was choosing better. He hadn't understood that in leaving, he was giving me the exact conditions I needed to become it, to become the clearest, most capable, most complete version of myself. The coffee was still warm. The morning was entirely mine. I picked up my cup and stayed a while longer.